will now talk about ethics, ethics and foreign relations. And it'll be presented by Noa Landau, a journalist for Haaretz, who is the political correspondent for Haaretz and head of the news. She's also the head of the news of the English edition, and she's also part of the board. And she was the founder of Haaretz 21, which is a project in the Arab sector in Israel. So it's not the first or last time where Noa takes part in our conferences, and I'm very happy to give her the podium. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, and thank you to Mitvim for inviting us. I'm always happy to take part in your conferences, and I enjoyed the previous speakers' presentations immensely. We're now going to talk a bit about philosophy, so I hope you have enough energy for that. I'm going to talk about ethics and relations in two parts, the principal question or the local questions. So as for the principal or basic question, is there room for ethics in foreign policy? What's ethics? What extent of ethics? These are all questions that we can go back in time with, back to the philosophical, theological, greatest, most basic and fundamental questions about the nature of man, whether we live in an anarchy or it's a nature where we are one against the other, or whether our natural position is to collaborate and have shared values and common denominators. And whoever learned public learned um, then by Hobbes and so on, then basically this is the question: is human nature an anarchy or shared values and collaboration? So in the imperialistic era, they tried to justify controlling other nations by saying that they're developing them. This was Marxism that looked at materialism, feminism, and I can't wait to hear Tanya after me. And of course, the philosophy of post-World War II, when the international establishments were set up, striving to present shared values by the entire international community. So at this time, the foreign relations or international relation literature also evolved, and it has a lot to do with your school of thought, because Morgenthau and others political science scholars will say that there is no room for ethics in foreign policy. People in different countries have very narrow interests, and it's a sum zero game over resources, and power is the main resource, whereas the liberal or idealistic schools of thought will say simplistically that there is room for ethics, we can collaborate in the international arena, we can have shared values and shared interests, various institutions can promote this, and it's just as important as use of force. If you think about the values of the shared values in the United States, the Americans have always worked or have always acted based on these values. Of course, there's also a kind of in the middle, different red lines. There are also combining approaches that even being proper as a country serves it. For instance, Yossi Beilin wrote about that here in Israel. And I think that to date, and I'm emphasizing that it's to date, the bon ton in the international system is mostly controlled by the Western liberal narrative, where there's an international law and shared systems and so on. To date, it is still relevant, especially after Trump was not re-elected, and now everyone's optimistic. And here again, Biden in Afghanistan is an asterisk. So this liberal thesis in general has not been crumbled, but it's being threatened by China, by Russia, by the extreme right in Europe. And in this campaign, and now I'll move on to the domestic front, to Israel. Here, Israel still to date has a strategic interest to be seen as part of the liberal Western side when it comes to ethics and foreign relations. The problem is that it's become harder and harder in view of the reality on the ground. Israel's foreign policy has shifted from the desire to become a part of the family of nations and the fact that in reality the occupation doesn't really allow it to be liberal. Look at Israel's public diplomacy, which keeps showing Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, a Western advanced a country with LGBTQ rights and so on. On the other hand, the objection to the UN, to international law, to The Hague, and the ICC and so on. So Israel's constant need to justify its military control of the Palestinians requires it to forge alliances with a non-liberal part of the international map, even if it wasn't the kind of ethical image we'd like for ourselves. We saw it with the alliances of the divide and conquer that Netanyahu initiated. We saw how he let go of all kinds of moral Jewish values in order to be in a relationship with Poland when it comes to the Holocaust and so on. We saw his relations with Trump, with al-Bashir in Sudan, with the Gulf states, the Saudis, the Chinese, even the evangelists who took the place of the American Jews who were too liberal for Netanyahu. So to say it bluntly, where there are leaders that disrespect the values of liberalism for whatever reasons, Israel is by their side because that's their shared interest to undermine this value system. On the other hand, Israel keeps saying wherever it can, especially when it meets liberals in the United States, like the Democrats, that we have shared values. Of course, we mean the shared liberal values fundamentally. And that's something that now that Netanyahu has left, it won't change, maybe in nuance, but not fundamentally, because Israel still justifies the occupation. Certainly under Bennett, we see the cracks in the coalition because of that, and it will continue to forge alliances with leaders whose liberal ethics are very weak, if they exist at all. And now that Russia is back, that will also contribute to this process. Another aspect that is very significant for Israel's foreign policy ethical aspect also has to do with our constant war and the occupation is weapons. Israel has decided to be as independent as it can be in terms of defending itself because of the French embargo and Israel supported the African apartheid at the time as part of that. And now cyber is also part from selling weapons to Burma. We have now gone back to being exporters of software that are being used to follow, to monitor, to persecute, and even to murder human rights activists. So is it even relevant in this new world when we have the weapon of cyber? So just to conclude, I don't think we can be 100% ethical and moral in this world of war and peace, because this question keeps emerging, that the Palestinian Authority is also not an entity that we should really seek to have peace with, but we should also aspire to have some red lines, like Yair Lapid when it came to Poland. It was a red line. It was a moral, ethical red line that he decided to draw. We don't have to have the Duterte get a red carpet who justifies the rape just because we want to sell him more weapons or we want his vote in the UN to perpetuate the occupation. It's not that Israel doesn't have any ethical considerations in foreign relations, but it is finding it more and more difficult to find a balance, to strike a balance between the liberal image it would like to have and the reality on the ground. And it doesn't allow her to have a coherent position in foreign relations because it doesn't have one, Israel.